Well, welcome to another night of church history. Let's start with prayer and then we'll get started with lecture. Heavenly Father, we are just so grateful for today. We're so grateful for this week that you have allowed us to begin. I thank you for the safe travel you've given to each person tonight so that we can be here together. I just ask that you would be in the midst of us. I pray that you will give clarity to my words, that you will give flow to what we're going to talk about tonight. And Lord, I pray that people will just get closer with you, learn more about you, understand the history of your church a little bit better. And Lord, that we can just understand where we've come from and where we are and where we're going. I just thank you so much for this time. It's a true privilege to be here with these people and just discuss a little bit about you. We ask all of these things in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so tonight I want to start, as I was reading the chapters that you guys were assigned to read, I realized that, I'm glad you remembered because I didn't. We just started, so you haven't missed anything yet. Okay, so I realized as you guys were reading these two chapters, I don't remember which one or where it is or whatever, but in the midst of whatever was being discussed in these chapters, I realized that the author is talking about events that haven't happened yet, as if you know those events have happened and when they happened. Do you know what I mean? There's kind of a little bit of, I think this is just something that happens when you're trying to parse down whatever 2,000 or 3,000 years of knowledge into a few chapters in a book, and especially with someone who is, I'm assuming, well versed in church history, these things happen. Like when you really know a lot about something, sometimes you end up talking more about that. You end up talking about that in a way where the people you're trying to teach, they are not there yet. And so, I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever had professors that are way like up here and you're wondering why you're in their class and it's a 101 class and you're like, what? So anyway, I don't really think that this is quite that big of an example, but I do want people to understand that there have been two major splits in the Christian church that have sort of brought us to where we are right now. And the book referenced all three of the resulting, all three results from those two splits as if you already knew about them. And on some level, you do already know about them. It's not going to be totally new to you. I mean, I've even been using terms like the Catholic Church versus the Protestant Church, blah, 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 but we haven't even gotten to the place where those things exist yet. Right now, we're still in the age of just the Catholic Church. This is all one big Christian church, right? So I want to go through, and even though these dates are important, you don't have to know them yet. When we get to the sections where we actually discuss them and we're learning about them, that's when you'll need to know the dates. So if you want to learn them ahead of time, that's great. If you don't, then just forget it till we get there. But what I want you to know is that the universal church began way back in the days of the apostles, right? And then it progressed through until around 1517, just after 1517. 1517 is the year that Martin Luther nailed what is called his 95 theses onto the church wall in Wittenberg, or the church door in Wittenberg. There are a lot of things that we're going to discuss about why that's so important that I'm not going to spend the time right now because it's not important to tonight. But when he nailed those theses to the church door, it began something that couldn't be stopped, that ended up resulting in, that's why I have an approximate, this is not the year of the split, it's the year of the beginning. It began to make the split that was then known as the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, or the protesting church. That's where Protestant comes from. So Martin Luther had some questions for how the church was running its affairs, and those questions were actually ignored to begin with. And then as the people found out about these questions, they sort of did that whole, yeah, that's a good question. What's the answer to that sort of thing? And over time, it turned into a place where people were drawing lines in the sand and saying, okay, where are you going to set your feet? Are you going to stay in the Catholic Church, or are you going to plant them in what is so after that called the Protestant Church, okay? So when the book is talking about Catholic, unless it says Roman Catholic, if it just says the Catholic Church, we're talking about the difference between the initial church and the split that happened after 1517, known as the Protestant Church, okay? A few years after, or actually before, I got those backwards, didn't I? Sorry about that. Before that happened, I'm pretty sure I must have that date wrong. I must have the date wrong from memory. Let me just make sure.
I don't think so. I think it's right.
Because we're about to have the split. That's right. This happened first, you guys. I'm sorry, I wrote it backwards. So, in 1054, which is something we're going to start talking about tonight that we will expand on in the next class, is this Catholic Church, still called the Universal Church, but after 1054 and a series of events that we will talk about, there was a splitting of ways that dates back to all of this. That's why all of this is on the board again, so that we can review it and make sure that we have a firm foundation about what was happening politically. Because this is going to end up resulting in this split. There's going to be all kinds of torment and whatever that happens within the church during this time over years, over 400 or 500 years. And in 1054, the Catholic Church ends up distinguishing itself from the church in the East, and they started being called the Roman Catholic Church, because remember, in the West, this is where Rome was, and in the East, this is where Constantinople was, right? So this universal church started out all happy, so to speak, here, and then with all of this political turmoil that spanned across 400, 500, 600 years, at the end of that, this church said, we are no longer in alignment with the church in Constantinople. We are no longer aligned with them. We want to distinguish ourselves from them. We're still Catholic, but we are now the Roman Catholic Church. And this is called something completely different, called Eastern Orthodoxy. Okay? So to be more accurate, since I got these backwards, this should say Roman Catholic. Because the Protestant Church and the Eastern Orthodoxy is still off on its own. So there's this, and there's this. Those are the three churches that stem from those breaks. I'm sorry that I mixed up I should have put these in another order. That was totally me not paying attention. I've got Martin Luther on the brain. That's what happened. I've been reading a lot about him lately, and I just put him first because I was reading about him. So, does everybody kind of have that clear? So as you're reading through the chapters in the book and they say, oh, Eastern Orthodoxy this, oh, Roman Catholic that, oh, Catholic that, oh, Protestant that, these are the things that you need to know about it. Let me just...
And didn't the Roman Catholics excommunicate the Eastern Orthodox at that point?
That's what happened in 1054. So really what I should have done, let's do it this way. I know you guys don't have a magic eraser on your paper, and I apologize for that. What really should happen here is that now here is you end up with Roman Catholic. And Protestant. That way, at least it's correct looking at it. So, as your book is discussing these things, try to keep, because if the book or whatever it is that you're reading is being accurate, then there should always be a difference. We throw around Catholic very liberally. We use it for everything. I go to the Catholic Church. We aren't staunch about saying, I am a Roman Catholic. Well, some people are, I suppose. But in general, society in general is not staunch about, I'm Roman Catholic, as opposed to just Catholic. It's all the same in our society. But if you're reading about history, if it says Catholic, it should be prior to 1054. If it says Roman Catholic, it should be after 1054. If it says Protestant, it should be after 1517. Okay? And even some history books and history texts and things like that, especially here, they'll get lax just like we have gotten lax. You know what I mean? Oh, sorry. So just bear in mind that, and be graceful. If you choose to read up on things later on, be graceful to the author who may be more more focused on whatever the book is really about and start saying Catholic instead of Roman Catholic whenever he or she should be saying Roman Catholic. Just be aware as you read, if you're talking about prior to 1054 and you see the term Roman Catholic, just internally roll your eyes and say, that's not Roman Catholic yet, that's just Catholic. Okay? That will help you if you ever have conversations with people who are in the Roman Catholic Church or even in the Protestant Church, because the history gets very muddy. And if you're not clear on certain facts like this, then you end up getting things mixed up and confusing people and kind of looking like you're not sure what you're talking about. Okay? This kind of clarity will help somebody listen to you. If you can be clear like this, they'll understand that you really have studied and that you hopefully know what you're talking about. Okay? Is that clear to everybody? Okay. All right, so let's start off. I just want to go through the history that we've already talked about. Up to this point, we've already talked about all of this. So I just want to go through and make sure everybody has this concise understanding of the history so far and kind of the time frame, okay? So Diocletian was the author of this split. He decided to split the empire, remember, into East and West, and they had the emperor and they had the Caesar. And then the emperor would step down after a certain amount of time. The Caesar would take his place. A new Caesar was appointed, and for a certain amount of time, on and on and on, right? So we had Maximian going to Constantius Chlorus, going to Constantine. And in the same time frame, we had Diocletian going to Galerius, going to Maxentius. Now, as soon as Maxentius became emperor, one of his first objectives was to leave and start heading toward Rome to meet up with, and actually Constantine was not in Rome, but he started heading that direction. Constantine was over in Europe. Remember, he and his mom were sent away because his mom was a barmaid, and suddenly his dad is a high official, blah, blah. So Constantine starts coming from Europe, and Maxentius starts coming from the west, and they meet just north of Rome along the Tiger River at the Milvian Bridge. They have this battle, and although very, very, very much outnumbered, Constantine was the winner. Maxentius died in that battle, remember? And in 312, that's when that battle happened. That's an important date that I want you to know. And then the very next year in 313, Constantine put out the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan officially declared Christianity as a legal religion in the empire. Okay? Not a mandatory religion, a legal religion of the empire. Okay? There's a difference. So, because of this legalization of Christianity, which was, for all intents and purposes, a wonderful thing, the secularization of the church happened because it suddenly became, because Constantine was pro-Christian, it became very important that you claim Christianity in order to get good jobs and, whatever, right? So then people who really could care less about what Christianity teaches or how to live a Christian life, they began to flood into the church. Still even practicing pagan religions and doing whatever, but just verbally claiming Christianity, living however they wanted, verbally claiming Christianity, mixed in with people who were serious and living a Christian life. So the secularization of the church came in. Now remember that Constantine wanted to use Christianity to unite the empire. That was going to be his main tool. But they were fighting amongst themselves primarily, not solely, but primarily because of Arius and his theology that he was introducing, saying that Christ was a created being created by God the Father. Okay? And all that comes with that. Well, so Constantine calls this first ecumenical council, brings all of the bishops all over the empire, pays for them, their food or their travel and their food expenses and everything, brings them to Nicaea, and they have a big council. They talk about lots of stuff, but the primary thing is, what are we going to do about Arius? Arius shows up The debates happen, blah, blah. End of the day, Arius is condemned as a heretic, and the Nicene Creed came out of that. And in that creed, if you read the first 8-10 lines, it's very clear about God the Son being eternal, and that he was not created, that he is an eternal God, right? Okay. Then in 320, well, it was actually before. The year before all this happened, remember his brother-in-law, Licinius? We didn't talk too much about him except to say that he allowed Licinius to rule the Eastern Empire, while he was doing his thing. Well, they got into a fight. Licinius was maybe getting a little power hungry. Who knows? They were just not getting along. This battle of Chrysopolis happens in 324. Licinius is killed. And this is where Constantine becomes the sole emperor. And he, by all accounts, by definition of not having another emperor on the east side anymore, he has now reunited the empire. Okay? Then this Council of Nicaea happens, right? Okay, so that's basically where we've left off as far as the timelines or the history of. This is Constantine's brother-in-law. We just barely mentioned him. He's not a name that you have to know for the test. It's just important to understand. The reason I put him up here is so that you can understand that Constantine becomes the sole emperor of the empire after he goes up and defeats his brother-in-law. And at the same time, as many texts will say, as sort of a, thumbing his nose at his brother-in-law, he took where his stronghold was located in Byzantium, took claim of it, renamed it to Constantinople, and then moved, this is so critical, then he moved the capital of the entire Roman Empire from Rome. We're talking about the Roman Empire. He moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople, this new city that he's just renamed for himself, right? Okay. And remember, we talked a little bit about what happened whenever that when that change happened. So before I get into that, one of the other things that happened where this Council of Nicaea was sort of the first step into it is, so Constantine called the council and he said, you guys get it figured out. But what I didn't really emphasize before is what he said was, get it figured out or I'll figure it out for you. But one way or another, all of this bickering is going to stop because you are dulling my tool, my blade that I'm trying to use to sharpen this empire and get it together. You're messing with my plans. So either get it together and get something figured out, or I'm going to figure it out for you. This is your opportunity, right? So that's basically what he said. And they did. They figured it out, wrote the creed. Everybody's happy. But what's important to understand is that Constantine, in sort of making that statement, even though he didn't have to enforce it, in making that statement, what he was doing was putting himself over the church. So the bishops and the priests and the this and the that were running the various churches around the empire, they ran their church and cared for their people and did the things that they do. But ultimately, if it came down to it and the churches were not, quote unquote, behaving themselves in whatever respect, Constantine, he totally would have stepped in and just brought down the law, and they were going to do what he said. And it had nothing to do with scripture. It had nothing to do with a spiritual hierarchy, nothing. So along with the secularization of the church, this flooding in of basically non-Christians into the church, claiming Christianity, the other side of that is the government got themselves into the church. Okay? That becomes very important with what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay? We're going to get back to Theodosius in a minute, but just to make a distinction before we really get started, from 379 to 395, you don't need to know those dates. It's just for a timeline for you to understand where you are in history. This Emperor Theodosius, he ends up being emperor for this date range. He is not joking around. He is hardcore Christian. And what he does, and it talks about this in one of your, this is from a previous chapter. It may have been, I think it's page 102. if I remember right from looking at it earlier today. Yes. So if you want to, well, I'll just read it so you can not have to worry about it. So this section is talking about Theodosius when he had come to power. This is one of the imperial commands that he set out into the Roman Empire at that time in 380. It is our will that all the peoples we rule shall practice that religion which the divine Peter the apostle transmitted to the Romans. We shall believe in the single deity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit under the concept of equal majesty and of the Holy Trinity. We command that those persons who follow this rule shall embrace the name of Catholic Christian. The rest, however, that is an awesome ringtone. The rest, however, whom we adjudge demented and insane, shall sustain the infamy of heretical dogmas. Their meeting places shall not receive the name of churches, and they shall be smitten first by divine vengeance, and secondly, by the retribution of our own initiative, which we shall assume in accordance with divine judgment. Now, one of the things I want you to notice, if you end up looking at this, the word next to the last sentence, the word our is capitalized and the word we is capitalized, meaning that he is equating the Roman Empire with God on some level, because he's saying we, as in God and I, our initiatives. Okay? So he is the person, so that's why I made this distinction a second ago. Constantine made Christianity legal. Theodosius made it mandatory. At this time, this is when you start seeing pagan temples being destroyed, statues being torn down, just artifacts of paganism being removed by whatever means. And starting with the beginning and coming all the way through Theodosius, I made a statement last time. I did it a little early, but I made a statement last time where I said Christians went from being persecuted by the government for being Christians to being accepted to actually persecuting one another for whatever it is. Because remember, during the secularization of the church, you had people claiming Christianity who were pagans. They were practicing pagan religions, right? They were still doing their thing and living their life. When Theodosius came on the scene and those people were doing that, from the outside viewpoint, you had Christians killing Christians. Okay? So it made, in just a short amount of time, I mean, there was a lot of persecution, and then in a short amount of time, it didn't take very long for the Christians to forget what persecution is like and begin to dole it out. Okay, with government help and mandated by the government. Okay? All right. So that's sort of the history of where we are starting. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about Augustine. So if you guys had a chance to read the chapter on Augustine, I hope, or I don't know, it strikes me every time I read this chapter about Augustine, he was really, really, really messed up. You know, he was such a normal person. And whenever we really get down to who Augustine is and the impact and the influence he has over the Christian church in general, like he is a bigwig. He's huge in both Roman Catholicism and in Protestantism, which we'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But I love reading about and remember when we were talking about some of the early fathers like Polycarp and Ignatius and all this, and some of them, they were like, oh, well, we're not sure when he was born. We didn't really know what happened with him. And then suddenly one day he's on the scene and he makes this big, huge impact, and then he's martyred and we move on. And so he's a big name in Christianity, but really the only things we know about them are the things right before the end of their life. They were basically nobodies until they became somebody in the church and then were persecuted and martyred, right? Augustine was very different. He came from a pagan father and a Christian mother. I mean, that should give hope to so many people who grow up in households of mixed theology. I mean, one of the most influential people in our history. That's how he grew up. And then whenever he went off to school, he got sort of enticed or tempted, or however you want to think of it, and got into a relationship with somebody, lived with her for 13, I think, years, the book said, had a child with her. I mean, these are very not good, but normal things. Like we see that kind of stuff all the time. And then had this crisis of faith, which the book goes through. I'm not going to go through all of the stuff that he went through, but if you haven't read it, you should read it, because it's really interesting to see this giant and know that, man, he was totally normal. He was all messed up and did all kinds of things that you would look back on his life and go, I mean, just like when the Roman Empire put Constantius Chlorus in, they're like, you're going to have to ditch your wife and your kid, and you're going to have to marry somebody that would be, so-and-so's daughter up here, so that you are appropriate. I mean, if they did that to Augustine, he would have never been qualified to even be in the church. I mean, his past was really pretty tainted. But God is amazing, and he takes all that mess and all that turmoil and all that chaos and all that pain, and he turns it into something beautiful. And not just for Augustine, but for us. I mean, all of us benefit from him. So I love reading about him, not because I love reading how people are all messed up, but it's what it sounds like. That's not really it. I just think it's amazing. I mean, Pastor Khan has said so many times, God can do anything with any situation. All you have to do is be willing. That the person just has to be open to what God has for their life. Man, Augustine is a perfect example. It's a beautiful example of what God can do in somebody's life if they will just be open to him. So anyway, there's my soapbox for Augustine. So you can read all about his history and all this business that he did in the book. But I want to start with so the book also talked about just prior to his appointment as being Bishop of Hippo, and I want to point something out that will come up again in a future lecture. But there was one point after he came to Christ that he went, because he ditched his girlfriend, ditched his son, was, doing his own thing. And after he became a Christian for real, he found his son and actually went and got his mom, and they all moved with him together. They were sort of traveling together and living together, and sort of, it's kind of a feel-good story. And very close in timing to each other, he lost his mom and his son. And it was not very long before this appointment happened. So he was in a major grieving period. He was in very serious mourning. His mom died first, and he was very close with her. And then not too long after that, he lost his son. And so he was just really not in the best place as far as like, yeah, I think I'll take a new job. So what your book mentions, and it's really important to understand this, because Augustine was well educated. And because of his education, because of his history, during all this time that his life was spiritually a mess, his career history was being built, and he was getting a reputation, and he was very intelligent and sought after in some circles. And so it became apparent to the church at large that he would make a good bishop. And so he was actually appointed as the bishop of Hippo. He didn't come in asking, can I be the bishop? They said, you're going to be the bishop of Hippo. And he's going, I don't really want to. I don't want to. I mean, he was still grieving. Like, who wants to take a new job when they're mourning two people, right? They don't care. George is like, nope, you've got the job, sorry. You're going to see that happens a lot with the church. We're a pushy group of people, apparently. So he became Bishop of Hippo in 396. And most of his life, the book talks about this too, most of his life while he was bishop and thereafter was consumed with literary teachings against Donatism and this Pelagianism, which that may not be how you're supposed to say it, but I'm just doing the best I can. It's written up here, so say it however you want to say it. So these two things, Donatism, basically, this formed after, again, going back to those, after the Great Persecution, where those three groups of people were formed: the martyrs who died for Christ, the confessors who did not die but wouldn't deny Christ, and then the lapsed who did deny Christ but survived their because they denied Christ, their apostasy. What the book points out now is that even some of the leadership of the church ended up in that group. So when we talked before, we were really talking about sort of the lay people doing that. Even the leadership, some of the leadership of the church were denying Christ in order to save themselves during that time. So the Donatists recognized that the leadership should never be allowed back in their opinion, should never be allowed back into the church, and especially not into a leadership position. You blew it, you're out, right? That's sort of the idea. So Augustine did not agree with that. He lived a life of second chances, right? His entire history is full of what the grace of God can do in somebody's life. And so he was very committed to fighting against this idea that you make a mistake like this, and it's apostasy we're talking about, denying Christ. That's a big one. It doesn't matter. If God allows you back in, if the grace of God extends to you, we as the church have no authority to remove that, okay? And he cites Peter denying Christ those 3 times, and he uses that as one of his biggest examples. Okay, so then the other people, their big issue that Augustine had was, their doctrine was that while most people, they sort of separated themselves from the sin of Adam. And they were saying that people in general are sinners, but there are groups of people who are capable of living a sin-free life. And Augustine completely went against that. He never claimed, I mean, his history is not really the one that you'd want to talk about, a sin-free life, but his point was, you know, everyone is depraved, and it goes back to this sin of Adam that we all live under. And they denied that sin of Adam. They were saying the sin of Adam was for Adam, and we have our own issues we have to deal with, and some of us are capable of living our lives not having any of those issues. And Augustine totally refuted that and spent many years, I think the book said 15 years of his life, literally, and probably in debates too, but in written form, fighting against these 2 groups of people that formed while he was in power, so to speak. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to point out, so before Augustine really truly converted to Christianity, something interesting happened to him. He was actually, the book talks about this, he was actually practicing a heretical form of Christianity for a little while. I'm not going to get into that at all. But when he left that, he was kind of searching around trying to figure out where he fit, right? Well, it's so interesting. His life is just so interesting. So he ended up going into, so there was this Bishop Ambrose. Okay, so this gives you a time frame too. Bishop Ambrose of Milan. He had heard of him. He was very famous and was well known around at least the Christian circles. He was well known. And he decided that he was going to go and start learning how this man taught. Not necessarily learning what he taught, but he wanted to go and learn from him as far as how he teaches, how he puts things together, how he presents. He wanted to learn from him, right? But more of like a structural learning, not a spiritual learning. So anyway, he starts listening to this bishop. And as he's listening to him and kind of trying to absorb all the things that he's hearing, at the same time, he ends up, do you remember I was talking about Pachomius? He was that general who was at the Milvian Bridge but survived. He was on Maxentius' side, and he was in that attack, but he was a survivor. He retired, and he ended up becoming a monk. And then he took 2 of his buds and went up to Rome for a year or so and took a copy of Anthony's biography with him that had been written, and was teaching people and using Anthony's biography as a kind of a foundation for why aesthetic lifestyles are good, and just basically giving yourself to God is a good thing. Well, he had heard of Pachomius. He had heard about this trip that he had made to Rome. He heard about the impact that trip had on the Roman people. It led him to Anthony's biography, and he read it. As he was reading Anthony's biography, by the time he was finished with it, he was completely spiritually challenged. Because, do you also remember I told you Anthony was illiterate? Most people believe that Anthony was illiterate. He could not read, he couldn't write. I don't know if I told you this or not, but did I tell you that Constantine sent a letter to Anthony? Did I tell you that story? So cool. So Anthony was famous enough that Constantine sent him a letter, and he couldn't read it. And so he didn't, because he couldn't. And so he wrote him back and basically said, don't glorify your life or don't glory in the fact that you are an emperor. Glory in the fact that you have an opportunity to be saved. Glory in the fact that you have an opportunity to spend eternity with Christ. He has no idea what the letter said. And he's like, don't worry about being an emperor. Just worry about being a Christian. That's basically his response, and he sent it back, right? I don't know if Constantine got it or not. I'm assuming he did. But anyway, so Anthony was well known. Anyway, whatever, that's a side note. So anyway, Augustine's reading his biography. He probably knows about this letter, I'm assuming. I have never read that, I'm just assuming it. And Augustine, this greatly educated, super smart, very influential guy, is reading about this illiterate hermit living out in the middle of nowhere who couldn't even write his own biography, sleeping on stones, giving everything he had except what he needed to survive. And he writes this profound writes these profound statements, teaches these profound doctrines that are right in line with Scripture. And he has sort of a reckoning with himself, because up to this point, he has thought, I'm pretty smart. I kind of get the Scriptures. I don't quite know where I fit yet, but I get it. I'm there. I can teach people. I can do this. I can do that. And then as he's trying to figure out where he fits, he learns about Anthony, and he's like, that dude didn't fit anywhere. Like, he couldn't even read. And this is what he did with his life. It's amazing. So he kind of had a self-discovery sort of moment. And it wasn't too long after that I think they talk about it in the book, where he hears the girl singing the little song, and it takes him to Romans and whatever. And he, not too long after that epiphany about Anthony, because of Anthony's writings and his biography, or he couldn't write, because of his teachings and the biography about him, he gave his life to Christ, primarily also under the teaching of this Bishop Ambrose. So it was kind of a perfect storm of situations. He was highly educated, all over the place, totally in need of a savior. Like, he was, consumed with trying to figure out how to do things right. Shows up in Milan, starts learning under Ambrose, but not for spiritual reasons, but just learning under Ambrose. Reads about Anthony, hears a little girl singing in a park as he's walking outside one day, and then all of it just comes together, and boom, he ends up truly, for real, becoming a Christian. And after that, that's when he becomes the Bishop of Hippo over time, a little bit later, and then ends up writing all of these influential things against these two groups. But what's even more amazing is I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think it's just appropriate to say it now. Augustine is truly unique, because I think most people would agree that this split between the Roman Catholic and the Protestant churches, it's still a major sore point with certain people. I mean, with some Protestants, they just say awful, terrible things about Roman Catholics. And with some Roman Catholics, they say awful, terrible things about Protestants, whatever. But it's interesting that Augustine is a father of the church that both of these branches totally claim as foundational to their doctrine, foundational to their understanding, foundational to who they are. And I'm going to read this so that it's succinct. The Roman Catholic Church looks to him as the founder of their ecclesiastical hierarchy, meaning how the church is put together. And the Protestant church looks to him more for his saved by grace doctrine that came out of the Donatism that he was fighting. Okay? So it's just very interesting for two entities or two groups of people that fight what could be, violently in some cases. Most of us know about, wars that have happened in other countries, and even in our own country, there's been fighting with that in mind, that this one person can be completely claimed by two opposing, so to speak, doctrinal belief systems. So it's just very interesting. So Augustine was really unique and really important. His most people would say that his most popular writing is this book called The City of God. He spent the last 12 years of his life writing it while he was living in Rome. It is, it's basically, so when Rome fell, which we haven't really talked about yet, or in the declination of Rome, let's say it that way, as Rome was declining, we've talked a little bit about this before too. The pagans said it was the Christians' fault because Christianity was introduced and eventually enforced, and they still had the belief system that if you're not paying your homage to the pagan gods, and you're paying homage to a different god, their response to that is famine, you can't get pregnant, cities are destroyed, empires are beginning to decline, that kind of thing. So the pagans still looked at Christianity as the reason that in general that the Roman Empire was declining, right? So the City of God is Augustine's refute to that, saying it's not one God fighting against another and one is winning over the other or whatever. That is not what's happening here. And he goes into why that's not the case. And my understanding is that Chuck Colson wrote a book called Kingdoms in Conflict, which is a modernized version of the City of God. And it's supposed to be a little bit easier to read. I have not read either book, but my understanding is that Kingdoms in Conflict is an easier read, but basically a modernized version of Kingdoms in Conflict. So just in case anybody's interested in that. Okay, so now let's get back to, I want to talk a little bit about, we're skipping around a little bit in time because I have to pull everything together at the end. So now I want to talk a little bit about this Bishop of Ambrose and Theodosius, okay? So while all of this is happening, okay? So Theodosius becomes emperor, and in 390, so 5 years before he was no longer emperor, something happens. Okay, so in Thessalonica, they had sports happening. Thessalonica has an arena, okay? And within that arena, they had games that were going on, okay? So they had chariot races and things like that happening. And they were just like, it's kind of funny. It sounds like when you read it, it's just like sporting events of today. You have your favorite football player, you have your favorite baseball player, you have your favorite, whatever soccer player, whatever your game is. Well, you might have your favorite chariot racer. It's the same thing, seriously. So they had fan favorites and, people that are all, oh my gosh, look who's here. He's going to race today, kind of thing. It was like a big deal. So there was this chariot racer who was arrested for homosexuality. He was caught somehow and he was arrested for this. The timing of his arrest meant that he was not going to be able to participate in the sporting event that was coming up. Okay, I don't know if he lived in Thessalonica or if he was just visiting in order for the event, but in any case, he got arrested and it was going to keep him from participating in this sporting event. And the people got real upset. They were really upset that this guy couldn't race. And so they were so upset that a riot formed. Okay, and in the commencement of this riot, it got crazy enough that a few Roman soldiers were killed. Okay? Now remember, this is not a day of cell phones or immediate information. Eventually, the information, because, the Roman entity in every city report back to Rome itself, right? So the governors of Thessalonica, they report back to Theodosius in Rome that these soldiers were killed for this riot because of this guy, blah, blah, blah. They tell the whole story. Well, he gets so mad. He totally freaks out. And he sends a legion of Roman soldiers to Thessalonica, and he says, wipe out the whole city. Every single person in the city, wipe them all out. So they take off. There goes the Roman legion heading for Thessalonica, right? Well, a couple of days after he sent them on their way, he thought, that was probably a little harsh. Probably shouldn't have ordered the whole city to die over a few people who rioted. That was probably a bit of a knee-jerk overreaction, right? So he changes his mind and he sends a messenger to go catch up with the legion and tell them, no, don't do it, and has whatever his alternate orders are, right? Well, by the time the messenger gets, the legion gets to Thessalonica, by the time the messenger gets to the legion to tell them to, stop it, 7,000 people, give or take, were killed by this army of soldiers, right? Well, Theodosius was just kind of like, well, sorry, I tried to stop it. Not quite this. I mean, I'm being really flippant. I'm not saying I don't know how remorseful he was or wasn't, but that's just basically what happened. He was 7,000 people too late. Okay? Well, Milan is also in Italy. It's just north and a little bit west of Rome. Okay? Kind of up in the upper west corner, northwest corner. So Ambrose is the bishop. Okay? And he is very upset about the way that these things happened. He's not at all pleased with what's happened. So what he does is he says, all right, Theodosius, you're out. No more communion. What does that mean in that time? No communion, you've lost your salvation. No fellowship with the church, you've lost your salvation. So he's basically excommunicated, but that term doesn't exist yet. He just cut communion off. Okay? So Theodosius says, well, whatever, okay, no communion, sort of doesn't really care. Well, 2 or 3 months, 4 months pass, and he's starting to feel a little bit like, man, it's just what happens when you are forced out of fellowship. You're like, man, I really want to go to church when you can't. I really want to go to church when you can. You're like, nah, I'll go next week, whatever. So he's falling into the same patterns we all do. A few more months pass, about 8 months later. So this happened in April. By December, Theodosius had approached Ambrose several times over that time period. He had approached him several times and said, I'd like to have permission to come back into the church or to take communion again. I'd like permission. Ambrose, nope, not going to happen. Well, by December, Theodosius was becoming very serious. I wouldn't say desperate necessarily, but we're real close to desperation. Now, we're talking about the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, okay? Remember his position. So he basically begs Ambrose, to allow him back into fellowship. So I think the story that I read it in several attempts. I didn't reread it before I came to class, so I may get some details wrong. But he was standing out in the snow with no shoes on. Maybe even kneeling in the snow. That may have been what I read. Begging in front of everybody. There's no snow inside this guy's office. He's out in the middle of everything where people can see him, begging Ambrose to let him back in the church. Ambrose let him back in. Okay, so now he's able to take communion, but realize what that does to Theodosius and to the Roman government. So remember with Constantine, he asserted himself into the church and was saying, if you can't fix your problems and behave, I'll make sure they get fixed. I'll make you behave, right? Now, just a few hundred years later, you've got Theodosius who is begging the church, who's not usurping his authority, like take over the government and rule for me, not that kind of giving up of his authority, but in humiliation, begging to be a part of the church, which just by action elevates the church. If it's that important to the emperor to be part of the church, that means the church is way up here, right? In the minds of the people. So it changes the way, and people, again, you don't always necessarily have these statements clearly in your head, but it just is what it is. In the culture of the time, that act changed the way the people viewed the church, and it elevated it a little bit. Okay? All right, so now you've got Augustine who's going through all this business, and all his life is just, is what it is. And he ends up wanting to study under Ambrose. Isn't it interesting? He wanted to learn, how did Ambrose teach? How was he successful in what he did? How was he successful in what he did? Augustine was not stupid. He was one of the brightest minds of antiquity. And he's going, wow, what is it that this guy is doing where he can even get an emperor to bow to him? Interesting. And then, in all of these things that happened, he was a major influence in how Augustine was saved. So, that is all I want to say about Augustine. All right, now, the last thing I want to talk about in the next 10 minutes or so is, so you have this political timeline of how things went. Let's talk a little bit about the church timeline that ended up in this, that will eventually end up in this split, okay? We are still in the early 6th century. This is 1054, so we're talking 500 years later. So make sure you keep your time frames in line so you don't get confused, just trying to put things together. So this happens, and then the church sort of changes in the minds of the people, right? As whenever the church was split way up here, and remember I kind of emphasized whenever whenever the church center was moved from Rome to Constantinople, the authority was also moved. The book talks about this a little bit, or touches on it anyway. Part of the reason that happened is because Constantine was fully inserted over the church. Even though he didn't necessarily make rules that say, I'm in charge, if he needed to, he enforced his own rule, right? Well, the people, this is an entire history of Roman culture. How the government is put together, the hierarchy of the people, how the government works, who reports to who has authority over who, right? As the government, and even before the government came into the church, remember that Roman minds are in the church. Roman minds are running the church. And so it's very natural for, whenever questions come up of, this bishop and that bishop have a difference of opinion, how do we decide who's right and who's wrong? Who makes that decision? Who is in authority over these two enough that they're going to decide to dispute? And so a hierarchy naturally comes out of that, of which Augustine is given credit for the entire Roman Catholic Church. He sort of develops, he's not solely developer, but he developed a lot of it. Okay? But it's Roman in basis. Okay? So Constantine moving the capital caused major changes to the church. Okay? The people in Rome, suddenly the bishop who was in Rome is no longer the top dog. Because I think the book hits on this too in the chapters. The bigger your population is, the more influence you have, right? If you're in Rome, the more influence you have because you're in Rome, which is the capital of the empire, right? Suddenly, now Constantinople's the capital, and this dude that was just hanging out in his church being the bishop of Constantinople, he's now the bishop of the empire. He's up here now. And this Roman bishop is now just influential because Rome's a big city, right? Crazy. And it causes a lot of conflict between jealousy and conflict, especially with Rome. They feel like they have had their feet swept out from underneath them and all of their authority a portion of their authority stripped from them and given to this regulating authority in Constantinople that really doesn't even know what they're doing, right? So, because that's starting, there were, I think the book touched on this too, there were basically 5 bishops that ran the empire, basically, with prior to Constantinople being formed, the Roman bishop was sort of expected and assumed to be the head honcho, right? And they were bishops in all the major cities. So Antioch of Syria, Alexandria, Egypt, I can't remember what they are. Jerusalem was given honorary, so that was one of them. Constantinople, and if I already said Rome or not. But anyway, there were 5 of them, okay? And it was just always understood that the Roman bishop was on top. Well then, as far as the empire is concerned, as soon as it moved, now it's understood and assumed that Constantinople's bishop is now on top. Rome didn't like that, and they fought it. Now, as time moves closer to this time frame, as things start moving along, then you start reading and inserting the times that these other small groups start coming in and attacking Rome from the outside. They talked about the Goths, they talked about the Visigoths, they talk about we'll talk more about them the closer we get to the time frame where they actually happen. But the Vandals and Attila the Hun were well, I got those backwards. Attila the Hun first, and then the Vandals. Those were talked about in your book, right? So you have these groups of people who are attacking the Roman Empire from the outside. Now remember, we were saying that at least in this time, it was starting to kind of disintegrate, and that's what Diocletian was trying to fix. And it did kind of fix it because Constantine did a pretty good job. Theodosius had control over the empire. It was pretty good. But as time keeps going, just the way that it is, the empire is still relatively unstable. The outer reaches, the soldiers are not well trained, people are defecting. If they start, like with Attila the Hun, he had a massive reputation for being very vicious. And so as he's coming into these small towns, the Roman soldiers are not even interested in trying to save those small towns. And even when they come to a town where they lived, their forces were not large enough or powerful enough to really fight Attila the Hun. So, I mean, he was really just taking control of the outskirts of this empire that were just not well protected. And as the book, I think the book told you this too, he actually was running his troops into the ground, right? There was pestilence that was going through his army, and so he was losing people because they were sick, and the strain of those losses, whether it be grief or whether it be we don't have anybody to help us fight, was starting to wear on the troops. And so they had very little food, they had very little water, and they were, probably not the people that you really want attacking you. They're not in a good place. They're in a bad mood all the time. So as they were coming in, that's what happened. So that is why there was this man named Leo, who was the bishop in Rome, okay? By the time Attila the Hun came in, he was in I think this happened in 420 something. By the time Attila came in, his troops were already ragged and worn down. They were, by some texts, they were on the brink of mutiny, okay? So here comes Bishop Leo. Now, as you were reading, this did not happen to me, but some people who are paying attention, it was not me when I read this the first time, you may have noticed that the book just sort of casually states, Leo goes out and meets Attila the Hun, right? That wasn't Leo's job. In what universe do you send the bishop out to meet somebody of war? I mean, that is not his job. That is not his title at all. But basically, the empire sent him out because the empire, who's way over there in Constantinople, having their big fun, they're not being attacked. They're not having any issues, right? They're way, way far removed from what's happening over on the shores, on the outer outskirts of the empire, right? So they're not sending any troops. They're not helping. They're not trying to help. Some texts will give them the will give the idea that perhaps because of the distance, the messages were not getting there in a timely manner. And by the time they got there and the troops would have been able to get back, it would have been too late anyway. That's very possible. Of course, most of them taint it to make it sound like the empire didn't care. But that's very probably the difference between a Roman Catholic-based person writing that and a Eastern Orthodoxy person writing that history. Do you see what I'm saying? The bias that comes in, for what it's worth. Anyway, so Leo had no choice. He had nobody. There was no authority to go out and meet Attila the Hun. He was the only person. So even though I don't know that there was an edict or whatever, a command that went out that said, you go meet Attila, who else was going to do it, right? That's why he went out to meet him. And his troops were all messed up and all, about to turn tail and leave anyway. So here comes Leo saying, please don't sack Rome. He starts citing, the history of Rome and the just Rome is grand and beautiful and you just can't ruin hundreds of years of history and blah, blah, blah. And Attila's like, whatever, we're tired anyway, which he didn't say out loud. He's like, okay, whatever, I agree. And suddenly Leo goes back into Rome. I mean, I bet he walked in going, okay, well, they're not going to attack. I mean, he had to be totally freaked out, right? So Leo goes back into Rome and he tells everybody, okay, Attila's not coming in. He's agreed to not come in and sack Rome. Well, again, center of the Roman Empire for forever, and the pride that lives within that city, they were so grateful to Leo. He became a star in that moment. And he became, his authority, whatever authority he had in Rome, went through the roof after he basically kept Attila from coming in and totally ransacking and destroying the city and the people. Like, there's no telling what they would have done to the women, to the children, much less, the stuff, right? Well, Leo became a star, and he, just a few years later, like 2 or 3, maybe 4 years later, here come the Vandals. And again, he goes out and he meets them. And he says, please don't sack Rome. For the same thing, start saying, all the same stuff. This is the heritage of our entire empire. Please don't destroy the city. Well, the Vandals, they weren't quite so broken. But they did listen, which is a God thing. I mean, who does that? So, they're completely vulnerable. They could have done whatever they want. Obviously, by the 14 days that they went in and did what they wanted anyway. But for whatever reason, God said, okay, 14 days. And they're like, okay, 14 days. That's the weirdest thing ever. Like, I just think that it kind of makes me laugh, right? God is hilarious. So 14 days. So the Vandals go in, they ransack the city, they hit every house. Some of the artifacts from the church were preserved, some weren't, whatever. But they did not destroy the city. That was the big deal. So as far as the people were concerned, even though the city was ransacked, they didn't focus on that. They focused on the fact that they lived through it and that Rome still stood. So now Leo has saved Rome twice in less than 5 years from attacks from the outside. Meanwhile, the Roman government, nothing. They've done absolutely nothing to help, right? So what started out as Christianity, like within the church, what started out as kind of a bruised ego sort of thing whenever the center capital moved from Rome to Constantinople, it kind of started out as a little bit of a cut or a bruise. Whenever these things happened with Leo, that really cemented the anger and the resentment that Rome, or the western part of the empire in general, held against the eastern part. Okay? It really cemented it. There was not a legal split at this time. But it was those things were the beginning and the undertow and the seed that 500 years later led to this, a complete split of what will be known as Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy is still the center of religion in that area. It's still very, very much alive. We'll talk about it later. So Leo is a key figure. We don't have time to talk about it. I'll hit on it as soon as we start class next time. There were two things that he did that were noteworthy. One is he proclaimed himself the Pontifex Maximus, which is the lead spiritual person over the empire, but he chose a pagan title, which is interesting. But he basically self-proclaimed that he is the spiritual head of the Roman Empire, with or without anybody agreeing with him, like the emperor. Okay? And the people said, yeah, he is, because he's awesome. Obviously, God favors him, blah, 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 after what happened with Attila the Hun and the Vandals. The second thing is, in having to defend that title, he claims Peter as the founder of the church. That phrase or that scripture that says, on this rock, I will build my church. Jesus tells Peter, on this rock, I will build my church. That he uses that and lays claim that, because he says, okay, I'm the self-proclaimed spiritual leader. And the people around, except in Rome, that weren't attacked, everybody else, they're like, well, who put you in charge? Who made you the boss? And he says, Peter did, or Jesus did when he gave it to Peter. And I am the spiritual descendant of Peter. It was the Roman Catholic Church is a spiritual, what we now call popes, is a spiritual descendant of Peter. The church itself, the person, it can be any person. So it's not the person, it's the position. And he claimed that position first and said it's because of Peter. So every person who steps into that position claims that. Whether they believe it or not, whether they realize it or not, that's what they're doing. Okay? So those are the two things that came out of Leo. And again, so much of this is political. It doesn't make it right, doesn't make it wrong. That's not what we're discussing right now. We can talk about that, whatever. But him having to defend himself and his position, especially after he feels abandoned by the empire, and he had to fight. He had to go out and, as a spiritual leader, go out to face war people alone. Oh yeah, he's claiming the authority, and he's going to do it by whatever means that is necessary. And actually, he's not the first person to have thought of it, but he's the first person to truly plant it and stand on it. But we'll talk a little bit more about that at the beginning of the next lecture, okay? Because I don't have time to get into it. I'm out of time, okay? All right, let's end in a prayer and get out of here. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this evening. I pray that you will untie knots of confusion, that you will put in line the things that have been talked about tonight. Lord, I pray that anything that was said that was wrong, that you would bring up and we can correct. And Lord, that those things that are pleasing to you, Lord, that you would plant seeds and let them grow deep, deep roots, that people would learn and understand where they came from and where we are today. We ask it all in your name. Amen.